In this video, we're going to go over the UV tools found in Maya 2018 and look at some workflows on how we can use these tools on actual in-game models. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get to the UV editor window. There's two ways I like to do this. If I want to keep the same kind of window layout as I have now, the big scene view, and just open up the UV editor on the second monitor, for instance. I'm going to go to Windows, Modeling Editors, and bring up that UV editor. We can see it right here, and you can dock that on the second monitor you might have, or however you want to do it. But I'm going to propose another method of getting to the UV editor, and that's going to workspaces up here in the top right hand side and selecting UV editing. For the purposes of recording this video on a single monitor, I'm going to use this mode, but this UV editor is the same one that we just saw pop up. I'm going to Windows, UV Modeling Editors, UV Editor right there. The UV editor is basically where you will see all the UVs for each model that you're working with. It's where we lay out the UV islands that we then texture upon in our texturing software of choice. There's one important tool that we like to use inside of the UV editor. I'm going to hide it for right now. If we go to Tools and select Show UV Toolkit, then we see we get this nice little toolkit popping up on the right side, and it's got a bunch of tools that we'll be using to create all the UVs we need. In fact, I'm going to forgo talking about some of these tools over here. Anything that we find over here, you can probably find it over here in these menus. There might be a few other ones that aren't listed in the toolkit, but for the most part, for the workflows I'm going to show us, for the workflows that will be able to UV pretty much anything that you want to throw at it. All of our tools will be held in this UV toolkit over here. So I want to talk about a few of these tools we find at the top of our UV editor real quick, and there to kind of help us visualize what's going on with our UVs and our model. So I want to select a model right here. Actually, I'm going to select this guy right here. And why don't we look at some of these options here that will help us understand how our UV layouts are working for us. So I'm going to zoom in right here and talk about these. This button right here, if you hover your mouse cursor over an icon, you'll get a little tooltip that'll help you remind yourself exactly what these little buttons do. Or if you're trying to explore some of the other tools that I may not go over in depth, it can kind of give you a hint on what it does and how to use it. So if we select the wireframe, we only see wireframes of our UV islands right here. If we select the shaded one next to it, we actually get our UV island shaded for us, and that's even reflected on our model over here on the other screen. The resolution looks wonky, that's because I'm zoomed in. I just want to show these menus up close. If we select this UV distortion, then we can see how well our layouts are working for us. And if we look at our skull right here on our hunter's shoulder, and then zoom in on the UV islands right here, we can see light shades and hues of blue and red. If something is white or grayscale, that means it's really well laid out. Red means it's too cramped, it needs to breathe a little bit. Blues mean that there's too much space devoted to it. But for the most part, this light hue is not so bad. For instance, though, if we take something like this and we exaggerate, you can see the darker the blues get, probably the more distorted you're looking at. But I'm going to undo that. So that's what this little button here is for. It's basically a progress report on how well your models aren't distorted. And we're seeing a little bit of distortion in reds and blues here because this is an organic model. There's just no way to lay out something that is, organic and without creating a bunch of seams. But remember, we try to limit our seams, and generally speaking, light distortion organic models isn't the end of the world. So I can turn that off. Our next button we have is our UV border button. If we click it, all of our UV border edges are highlighted, and we can even see that reflected on our model in our scene view. You can see the weird close-up view of the character right here, and we can see exactly where our UV islands are located on the model itself. So if we wanted to look at it normally, then we can actually just see everywhere there's a UV border edge. And we can turn that off and on. This next button, I'm going to skip over one just to talk about the ones we're going to use a lot. This little button here can hide and show the grid of the UV space. So if I zoom out, we can see how that works for us. And this button right here gives us a UV snapshot of how our UVs currently look. And actually, you can export it out as a file. So you get this whole, you click the little camera snapshot button. You can pick where it saves, give it a file name, example snapshot. Always export it out as either a Targa or a PNG. I always go Targa. And pretty much all the other settings are going to be standard. Right here, we talk about our size of our texture. So remember, powers of 2, 2048 by 2048 is kind of the standard size of most textures these days in modern gaming. They can double up to 4096, but we're going to keep it at 2048 right now. And I'm going to hit apply. And you see that we got a message say save to the desktop. And here we have, let me just open up Photoshop real quickly for us. And we can see a nice snapshot of our UVs once Photoshop opens up and shows us. So we have Photoshop open. Now I have a nice black and white representation of what's going on with my UVs. I can double click this layer that it got imported as. Let's just call it layer 0, okay. I can then go to adjustments and invert the color so it's more black and white. And here's a little trick. What we do is we want to keep our UV layer at the very top. Let's call it UV down here in Photoshop. And let's set its layer to multiply. And with multiply selected, the way that filter works is anything we paint underneath our textures, we can see work for us. So you can see the way multiply works is it's like painting underneath your wireframe. And that's how we can import our UV maps into Photoshop to work on them. So that's a quick little sidebar right there. Let's get back to Maya and keep talking about some of these images real quickly, or more of these visibility image display will be the next one, or display image. There's a bug with 2018 right now, even though this is a project and my textures are actually showing up and linked on my model. Sometimes to get the texture to show up behind our UVs as we're UVing, we have to go into our Windows rendering editors, hypershade, and relink the texture to the file. So that's annoying. So I'm going to double click on the Granite material. I'm going to click on the color button right here. It's going to open up a window that's going to look something like this. And then just click on that folder and select my texture once more. And we can minimize that. And now we can see my texture underneath my UVs. And this portrait looking button right here is what controls that for us. All right. If we wanted to see what our model looked like with a checkerboard pattern, this is useful when you're trying to figure out texel density or just to see the distortion in general. We can click on our checkerboard button right here in our UV editor. And one last button, if we have our texture up, we can click on this slider right here. Make sure it's turned on, and we can adjust the brightness and darkness of our texture underneath. Sometimes it can be a little hard to see our UV edges if it's real bright. And sometimes you might need to make it a little bit darker so you can see those UVs. So I'm going to introduce the tools in our UV toolkit as we would use them in a workflow. Like, it wouldn't make much sense to tell you about pinning until we can actually create some UVs. So I'm going to go in my own little order here that mirrors kind of the order of the workflow that you might use these guys, so we can see some practical examples of these tools in action. All right, so why don't we take a look at, I'm going to get rid of this outliner actually. I'm just going to drag it in. We don't need it too much right now. So why don't we take a look at one of these models here. Let's see, which one do I want to use? Let's use the sword right here. And we're going to mess with the UVs here and kind of redo them. So in my UV toolkit, I'm going to go to the Create menu, and we have a bunch of different options on how we can actually start projecting and creating our UVs. There's really only 2 of these that I use in my workflows, and those being the automatic map. Sometimes it's just nice to get some quick UVs laid out. Maybe you're working with hard surface type stuff with lots of flat faces, and automatic map does a pretty good job of getting you a starting off point. It doesn't necessarily always get you off to a good starting point, but it's an option. It just basically takes a bunch of snapshots from all different angles of the sword, looks at the best way for like these faces of the blade to be projected, and it just does a bunch of planar projections all the way around it. A planar projection does kind of work the same way, except it's only a single plane that we project on. You see this little skinny thing right here? There's little tools on here. There's like a little red T down here. Let me do it again. A little red L or T down here. We can select that, and we can rotate it, scale it, and move it to our heart's content. It's kind of an old school clunky tool to use, to be honest, these days. Um, you know, it's just, you can already tell the automatic map did a way better job of getting, these faces exactly the way they need to be. So to that effect, I won't go over the planar, cylindrical, and spherical projection methods. You can play around with those, do your own research, but as far as I'm concerned, the only times those will be useful are in very particular situations. But pretty much with the workflows that we're going to be learning, it's just not necessary. The second creation tool or projection tool that we're going to be looking at is the camera-based. Honestly, this is the one I like to use the most, because we're going to be unfolding these UV islands anyway. So whatever way the current scene window you're working in, whatever way you're looking at the model, if you press camera based over here, it'll just take a snapshot of it right there. But obviously this isn't the best place to start from either, because we have a bunch of UVs, right here and right there. They're overlapping, and it's not flat. It's just basically a little snapshot of where this sword was. But for starting out, I kind of just do a quick camera projection just so I can get a bunch of messy UVs quickly, like you saw with the automatic map. Kind of messy, a lot of islands there. So I'll just do like a camera-based projection just so I can get something that looks like my mesh, something that's familiar, but ultimately not something that I can really use. This is just kind of to get a good projection and a good place to unfold from. So those are the creation tools I like to use. So the beginning parts of UVing, you're always going to start with some kind of projection, whether it be automatic or camera-based or any of the other kind of tools that you may want to play with and learn about. But pretty much camera-based is what I like to use at this point in the workflows of Maya. So after you get a nice projection, it's now up to you to start making trims and seams. I don't think this is I don't really think this is the best example to use for that, but I'll go with it anyway. So, yeah, this will work just fine, actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm going to mirror the sword on both sides. So I'm only going to UV one side of it. So I'm going to go right down the middle. get rid of anything that I'm obviously going to mirror later on. And I get something like this. I'm going to select, I'm going to have my sword selected, and I'm going to inverse select everything else and press H and hide it. Let's just get our sword looking pretty right there. All right, so now it's up to us to make certain cuts and seams so this thing lays out a little bit better. All right, so we're going to go to our UV toolkit and go to cut and sew. As we can see, we have some cut tools. These will be the most important tools in this section right here, cut and sew. Sewing, again, I consider it a little bit of an outdated workflow to use primarily these tools. That's not to say they couldn't help you down the line, and we'll quickly look at those. But I really want to talk about cut and the cut tool. I already know that this inside part of the sword here, such as these faces right here, those are going to need to be separated. There's no way we can flatten this blade out without these being heavily distorted. You know, I might jump ahead real quick and just go ahead and, so I'm going to just select this UV shell of the blade. And I'm going to do a quick unfold on it just to show you what I'm talking about. So you can see with a quick unfold, this is basically if you were trying to flatten a hat on a table, this would be you pressing down, stretching it out, trying to get it to lay as flat as possible. But we can see if we turn on our distortion little icon right here that shows us how much we're getting stretched. Not only does this just not look good and look workable, but we're seeing a lot of distortion that we don't need to see on. Really, it's not a very organic prop. It's pretty hard surface, pretty flat. So we shouldn't have to see any of those blues and reds popping through. All right, so why don't we take this and kind of just pull it out. I don't like to have anything in my square that's kind of trash, so that's why I kind of move the stuff out here. Because when you project and unfold, it puts it right in the center. And I think it's just good to keep that area rather empty. So look what we can do with our cut tool, though. We can go around and we can select these edges here, these 90-degree edges. And think of these as like cutting edges that we're going to basically make texture seams with. So I'm just going to keep selecting all the way down. There we go. Let me turn off some of that stuff. That distortion was making it a little bit hard to see. So I'm just going to select all these edges, and it's a pain since it's not a perfect edge loop. I could have just double clicked it, but I'm going to select them all myself and maybe end it right there. So from here, it's going to trace all the way up here. Oh, better cut that right there as well. And now I kind of have the edge that defines the flat part of this blade right here defined. And we're just going to go to cut and sew, and I'm going to cut those edges. And I can make sure they're cut by going into my UV editor and selecting UV border edges right there. Now you can see once they didn't have a white outline on them, but now they do. And if I go in and right click and select UV shell, I can move my blade, and we see that now that this is cut, they act as two separate UV islands. So that's the power of cut. Just select the edges where you want your UV seams to be, press the cut tool, and bada bing, bada boom, you got two separate objects. Now if I try to unfold this blade, look how much better that is, right? So much better. And now it's a simple matter of, oh, that's not very good. So our work's not done. We're going to go in and select some of these more severe edges. You know what? This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to select all these faces, and I'm going to select automatic map. Boom. That pretty much keeps the long strands that can be a complete island like this together, while separating everywhere where there's probably going to be a hard 90-degree angle, right? We've talked about that already. So that's just an example of how an automatic tool can come in handy for us. Okay, and I'm going to leave this. There's a way where we can kind of stack some of this stuff up if we wanted to share it all the same texture. I'm not exactly sure what the needs are for the sword that we're doing. Maybe it's a low poly asset. Maybe it needs to conserve as much UV space as possible. I'm just kind of showing us the tools right now. So that's really nice. Why don't we see how we can use the sew tools real quick. Say, for instance, you wanted to reattach this back flat part of the blade back onto the main body. So you wanted to put this back onto that sword. Well, first of all, let's find the edges. There we go. See, so this UV island should match this guy right here. And we can do a, let's see. Let me bring up my cutting sew menu again. We can do a stitch together. And as you can see, it resizes and moves the UV island down and stitches it together. A sew just takes it where it kind of is and the size it is, and look, it just sews it together right there. I mean, that's not the most elegant solution. So maybe before you sew something, you would have to resize it like this, and maybe let's see what happens there. Select the edges we want to sew. And it's just bad. Maybe now you can do another unfold. Maybe that's some way to do it. Sewing is just a way where you can kind of reattach islands back together. But if you're doing your edge selection correctly, going through and selecting your edges, then you should really never have to sew. You just kind of are going to visualize your UV islands on your 3D model. So I don't like to use sew too much. You know, there's a few tools like the interactive sew tool where you can kind of just paint it. I mean, I think it has to be in only certain situations will it work. Like if it's really close together or something. Yeah. So it has to be a little bit closer together. So you can see it's kind of like painting the connections back. I'm just not a big fan of sewing though, because I feel like you should have your islands mapped out pretty easy enough before you unfold them. There's no reason to really. Sewing used to be back in the day where you had to use these old school projection methods like create or planar or automatic, and then sew all the pieces from an automatic map together that need to be one piece. The automatic map didn't do a good job. Well, sew the islands back. We don't have to worry about that right now these days because we have that amazing unfold button that flattens our islands out for us. All right, so that's cut and sew. Very important to cut your edge seams with cut. It's kind of important to know that you can maybe sew them back if you need to reattach an island and you don't want to exactly reproject and unfold it, even though that's probably faster anyway. All right, let's keep going. We've already talked about this tool and used it because kind of need to unfold stuff to see how the benefits of creating perfect seams were. But let's just cover it again. We're going to go over the unfold tools and really just kind of talking about the ones that we're going to use the most. And obviously that's going to be the actual unfold button right here. You've seen me use it a few times already. Let me just show us that in action so we can take a UV shell like this. If we look at it right here, this is our hilt right here. Maybe we can get it to flatten out. So I'm going to click on the unfold as it is. Maybe. Why don't we bring up our checkerboard to see? We're kind of getting a lot of distortion here, aren't we? And why don't we bring up our hot and cold button here? And we can even see the reds and the whites. You know, this is perfectly laid out. There's no reason why a hard surface model can't be as well. This is not too organic. I bet I can do a better projection with this I'm going to duplicate it to show you guys what I'm talking about. I bet I could do a better unfold if I create some seams. So I'm going to create some seams at the corner here. And I got to decide how I want to do the seams down there. I don't think I want to do seams there. So we're going to use that cut. And why don't we unfold this now? So a little bit better. We're getting there. We're getting there. The more seams we can cut into basically certain parts, the better. It'll just be able to unfold a lot easier. But then you get little tricky things where the UVs just overlap, so you can't exactly unfold. You could definitely come in and create a big seam running. Let me get rid of some of these all the way around on here. But this was a hand painted model to me, so I didn't want to completely fill it with a bunch of seams. I'm actually kind of forgetting what I did. I think I might have just lived with some distortion, to be honest, now that I'm thinking about it. I don't know. Why don't we just go back and open up the seam? I want to remind myself how I did it real quick. Let's zoom in. And yeah, I guess I just lived with, oh, that's what I did. I cut off the bottom. So by cutting off these bottom faces into their own UV island, you can see it right here. I was able to get rid of a lot of distortion. Let's see how well it was. Well, maybe not too good. Look at these big blues right here. These definitely probably could have been closer together and looked a lot better. But it still turned out okay. So it's kind of a touch and go thing, right? How much distortion can you live with on your assets? So that's our unfold button. If we hold shift and left mouse button, we get a bunch of unfold options. So it's not too big of a deal to go in here. In fact, reset settings, default settings, will usually do pretty much exactly what you want it to. Maybe you're projecting, unfolding a lot of things at one time. You want to pack them all together so they're not stacked on top of each other. Pack may be good for you. But for the most part, we're going to be unfolding one island at a time and making sure they work really well. Optimize. So I think this was UV before these tools existed. So if I would have had an optimize, maybe I could have fixed some of that distortion. You can already tell it looks a lot better, right? All I did was click optimize a bunch of times, and we have less distortion. Those blue triangles aren't as bad. So optimize can be really nice if you just need to kind of fix up some severe colors like so. You can see now they're more faint. They're not as bad to deal with. I wanted it to be pure white, but I just couldn't. I had to make a compromise. I didn't want to break this thing up with a bunch of seams to paint over. So I'm going to have to live with a little bit of distortion there. And for the most part, it doesn't show up too bad, or if at all, in the model. This little bronze part is where I did the hand painting. And, it's kind of an organic-y, noisy, whatever kind of shape anyway. So it works for us. All right, is there anything else in Unfold that works pretty good? Straighten UVs can be nice. If you wanted, say for instance, after I did an optimize, I want this to be straight because, hey, it's straight right here. It should be straight in my UVs. I can click on the UVs I want to straighten out and straighten UVs. You can see how they kind of hop in line. And you can dictate what direction you want them to straighten in. So if I was doing something like this, up and down, and I did straighten, let's exaggerate a little bit so you can see a little bit more. And I did a straighten UVs only in the U direction. It's not going to straighten in the vertical direction. It's only going to straighten in the unilateral direction, the horizontal direction. But for vertical, Let me just click on the V there and straighten UV. Oh, there we go. And straighten shell. I don't know if this is going to be a good idea. It sounds like that's a big sweeping change. Straighten a UV shell by unfolding UVs around a selected UV or edge loop. So I don't know, maybe we can select this edge loop right here and straighten shell. Oh, that's crazy. Look what that did. It kind of straightened everything out in line with that. So if you're dealing with a lot of hard surface models, that could be extremely useful if you're trying to lay out your UVs in a grid according to one edge loop. You know, this is my center edge loop. Straighten everything else like a grid around it. Other than that, everything else is just kind of cherries on top that you can explore on your own. Highlight your mouse cursor over it, and you can kind of play along with these tools. But really, unfold and optimize and straighten UVs. These are probably the only ones I would be using from the unfold. Why don't we talk about pinning real quick? Pinning can be a convenient tool to use. Especially if you're doing something like a face. Let's say, so I got half my face UV'd right here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to quickly just flip it horizontally. I'll get to what those tools are in a second. And I'm going to grab this UV shell and move it close to here. And I'm going to use my sew tool to sew these two pieces of face back together. So hey, we're finding a use for sewing after all, aren't we? Okay, so we have a nice big face now, one flat size. I don't know, something looks a little weird down there though. Why don't we just reproject this then? What I'm going to do is I'm going to create. Trying to show you a legitimate use of how you could use pinning to your advantage. Pinning is basically freezing a UV in place, and so it doesn't get messed with if you unfold something or not. So I'm going to do a frontward facing face like so. I'm going to move the rest of these out of the way. And now I'm going to go in and just do an unfold, right? Oh, snap. There's no way that looks good. Look at all that distortion. Not too good. Not too good. So what we're going to do is we're going to, and this is kind of how you kind of how you're going to kind of UV a face in general. I'm going to go ahead and do another projection because that's scary juice right there. So we're going to do another projection. I need to find a seam, and I need to find one quick because look how much pain this guy looks in. Look at that neck. He's so much in pain. So I'm going to select that edge loop right there, all the way around the body, because that's where I want to cut a seam right in the top of his head so we can unfold his face like a mask. But I have all these other edges selected as well. Well, here's the beauty of the UV editor working for us. I can go into edge mode and hold down Control and deselect all the edges everywhere except on my face. And then I can come in on a side view and I'm going to deselect these edges up here on the front of the face because I only want to cut in the back of his head like if it was a rubber mask. And we're going to go to my sew tools, cut and sew tools. We're going to cut. And then we're going to do a quick unfold now that we got that nice cut there. Unfold, and there we go. And it might be noticeable that it's not completely unfolded down the center of the face too well. You see how it gets a little weird in the mouth. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all the UVs or the edges straight down the middle of the face. We're going to align them or straighten them vertically. Okay, so now we have a clear straight up and down middle line. I'm going to go to UVs. So I hold down Control and right click, and we can switch between edges. We can go to UVs, and I'm going to pin those UVs. And you can see I get like this blue frozen mask. So now when I unfold this, it unfolds along the center point. The center point doesn't move at all, but the rest of the face kind of unfolds around this. That mouth is looking really gross. I'm going to go to my cut and sew tool, and there's a create UV shell button right there, and whatever faces you have selected, it can kind of cut for you. But that's a little weird. Oh, it's pinned. So for this to be cut out all the way, I need to unpin, and let's select these faces again. That was funny. Let me undo that actually. So I'm going to unpin all actually, and let's select these faces again so I can actually cut this and take it off. Create UV shell. There we go. So now the mouth is looking a little bit better. Not the best though. This side of the mouth is rather weird looking. So why don't we just do another unfold? I'm going to select these edges again. I'm going to pin them again. And we're going to unfold now with a few optimizes. Yeah, and that's going to get things looking more symmetrical around the mouth. Of course, you could just mirror duplicate and then stitch the sides of the faces together. So why don't we do that? So we're just not getting that mouth exactly what we want it to do. See, it's just all crooked and stuff. So I'm going to cut this dude in half. In fact, I probably should have done that from the start. That's actually a pretty good selection. So now when I duplicate over, let's say I finished UVing his whole body. If I duplicate back over now, this is going to be a good use of the sewing tools. All right, we're going to do a -1 in the ZX scale. So there we go. And you can see that that we're still pinned. So let's unpin all. And let's move this over. I'm going to use my flip tool and my translate to flip it horizontally. And you guessed it, we're going to sew these islands back together and make use of that sew tool. I'm going to select this one over here. Let's unfreeze or unpin that one. Let's go ahead and do a mesh combine. I probably would only do this after the whole thing's UV'd, but I want to show us how we can actually do this. Use this tool. So we're going to select the edges straight down the center here. What's going on here? I think I need to merge the verts real quick after I just mirror duplicated. Merge verts. Let's do a smooth to make sure everything's looking good. Perfect. Now I can select these edges, and you can see since they share basically the same kind of border edge in their UVs, really easy to select. It kind of selects both at the same time. But I only want to select the edge straight down the middle of the face, and we're going to stitch it together. And now with pinning tools, so I unfolded straight from the center, and then with some mirror duplication and stitching, I have a completely laid out looking face. So that's the workflow for getting your face UV'd. You may also want to cut around the ears. See that edge group around the ears. Do a cut there. As you can see, my ears are not part of here. I separated them entirely before I did an unfold of the face. So that's how we'll unfold the face, by using pin tools, sewing, and flips. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the transform tools that I just was using for a second. So the transform tools have a lot of important uses for helping us arrange and work with our UVs here. Let me just move this down here. That's my face. Let's go into them real quickly. Transform. So don't use all of these, of course, as par for the course. But if you wanted to change the pivot point of any island you have selected, you can use this little grid right here for pivot. Something that I was using and I do use a lot is our move tool right here. This basically will shift over UVs. I think by default it's at 0.1. But if we change that value to 1, and then with our UV islands selected, UV shell selected, we can shift these over whole units. And that's how we shift over our mirrored UVs, 1 unit at a time with 1. Retain component spacing, basically, if you're snapping stuff and you want all the UVs to kind of snap together like so, you would take retain component spacing on and off. Let me show that example again. Let me undo that. So with retain component spacing turned on right here, if I was snapping, I'm holding down V and I'm going to snap to this UV, this little point right here. See how they keep their shape? No matter where I snap, they're kind of keeping that same curve shape. If I retain component spacing and turn it off, they all snap straight up in a line. They all get with the snap. Of course, that doesn't matter if you're snapping to straight from the center. You only really see how they all converge. That only really matters if you're snapping on an axis, like so, by grabbing one of the arrows. So that's quick movement options. If you want to do some quick rotational options here, for instance, I want to take the bottom of this foot island right here and make it go completely horizontal. Then instead of kind of manually doing it like so, I can go in and set the angles it rotates each time, and just click one click. If I want to do 45 degrees, I can do it 45 at a time, 15 at a time. I mean, the world's your oyster. Step snap, if you turn that on, the regular rotational tools now will only rotate, say, in degrees of 30. So that can be kind of frustrating. It can kind of be handy. Just make sure that it's turned off if you're not wanting to specifically snap when you're just using the regular rotational tool. That can be frustrating if you don't know that's on. Scale is a nice one. We got some scale tools right here. If you just wanted to make this, say, twice as big with a 2.0 right there, you can just click really big and do an embigment. And now you get a UV island that's twice as big. You can even do that in the directions you want. I just want it to grow twice its height, maybe double that. Or you can say I want it to grow twice its unilateral or its horizontal width. All right, I don't know if that means unilateral. Prevent negative scale. So let's say we had a side of this foot and we didn't have prevent negative scale, and we go to the center. It basically just flips the shape, right? That's how we kind of understand scale. But if you wanted it to where it just leveled out on a straight, it can't go negative. It's kind of a nice way for straightening up your UVs. You can do prevent negative scale. And one of my favorites, and you've seen me use this a few times. You saw me use it to flip the face. Let me show you how that works one more time. I can go in and select my face. Let's do a cut. Let's create a UV shell out of this side of the face. And I'm going to flip it. And remember, this is kind of what the duplicated face looked like. And then I picked it off. I went to my flip setting. I didn't flip vertically. I flipped along the U axis. Oh, let me go in and unflip that. So that's how we were able to flip and get that sewn really nicely. So flips are really good. And this is a very important one right now. This is Texel density tool. Remember how it was our very first concept in the last video. If we want to make sure that our texel density is accurate throughout the whole model, let's say, for instance, every part of the model is equally as important to see. But you can see that if I turn on my checkerboard, my squares are all different kinds of sizes, right? Well, let's say I want everything to roughly be at the same texel density as my leg. Well, first I'm going to select the leg UV shell, and I'm going to get its texel density, which is at a 2.8. Now I can select everything in my scene and press the set button, and they're now all at the same texel density. Notice how, aside from some of the distortion, how now everything kind of, and some of the bad UV unwrapping examples that I did for the human. Let me just select these. These just need to be crunched up a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to just set those one more time just to make sure. There we go. Perfect. I'm not exactly sure why I have the arm broke up like that, but these are just some examples of some bad UVs that I wanted you guys to start from. So now pretty much all the squares are the same size and everything has the same amount of texel density, meaning if this was packed as tight as it could be, all of these islands will receive the same ratio of pixels to one another. So this texel density tool and our transform menu, really awesome. So transform's got some real winners in it. Why don't we talk about the align and snap folder real quickly? So let's bring those up and let's talk about these. So we can find them right here. Basically, this is kind of a quick way to get your islands positioned where you want them. So I can select my arms and my leg islands, and I can snap them to the right side of the rightmost point of them. Notice how I didn't take it straight to the grid. If you want to do the grid, then you can take it to the right side of the grid. But basically, when you just use the alignments, it looks at the rightmost UV for this selection right here, and that would be this little guy right here. And it takes all of them and it aligns these bottom two with the rightmost point because I'm selecting align to the right. If I was going to go to the left, then it would look at this little guy right here and align the leftmost one right there according to that. So it kind of gets things kind of in a line depending on what island you have selected, not necessarily related to the grid. The snap is what we can use the grid for. So these are nice little quick ways where we can snap and align things. Again, more useful with different workflows, and you'll just experience those as we go along. I wish I could show more practically. It's just I'd have to. Let's see. How could I do it? The other buttons we have, snap and stack, are very important. Sometimes you just kind of want your UV islands to all stack on top of one another because they all will share like the same kind of generic texture. So why don't we look right here and see an example of that. I'm going to select this guy right here. Let's turn off some of these little tools that help. And we can see that with the pre-made texture before, I'm going to go ahead and relink this so we can see the texture behind there. That bug again. I'm going to pause and go. All right, I'm back. I got the texture show up. So why don't we darken this a little bit? So all the detail, all the islands we have right here are all stacked on top of one another because it's just area of detail that's just flat, no detail at all. Maybe it's glass or just pitch black. And sometimes you just need a quick way to stack a bunch of islands on top of each other because they all share that same kind of ribbed pattern, like so, like all around here. That's all these islands just stacked on top of this little rib texture. So uh, that'll be a good example to show. Let me just see. You can see there's just a bunch of islands right here, all stacked on top of one another. So I'm going to use this as an example. So let's say I had all of these, and I'm going to do a quick automatic map of those so you can see them all just laid out for us like so. So if we do a snap and stack, we can see them all the same size. Maybe the texel density is a little weird, so I want to go and do my transforms and get that texel density and then apply it to everything. There we go. And now we kind of get a nice stack of everything sitting on top of each other. And I can go in and, oh, I see what the automatic map messed things up. Let me go a few steps back. I'm going to use a different tool to get these separated. I'm going to go to the modify and go to unstack shells. And you can see all these shells that were once on top of one another are unstacked. And there you can see how many different shells are there. Now we can go to snap and stack. And we can see how we can quickly just get all of these right on top of each other again and back onto the detail where they need to be. We'll get that detail back. So that's snap. And a lot of these other things, you can snap UVs, match the UVs to a grid. That's a risky one, though, because if I was going to try to snap this to grid, match grid, then, you know, it can kind of get rid of some wonkiness. Say, for instance, this detail was kind of like this. Well, if you did they match the grid, you kind of get it to line up a little bit more, but it's not the most reliable. You'd be better off just snapping UVs together so they match. So, you know, some of these tools are very situational, and the more you use them and the more situations where you say, I wish I had this tool, then you get to find out, oh, that tool exists, and you just roll it into your workflows. So experience will really show you how some of these other tools can kind of help out and speed up some workflows. But for the most part, those have been some good tools. Oh, we got the arrange and layout to talk about real quick. That could be pretty important if you're wanting to get a quick head start on puzzling out your UVs after you you know, lay them all out. So here is a dude. Let's say, for instance, this is mess his whole UV stuff up. Let's just stack them. Snap and stack all on top of each other. Let's just mess up this texture utterly. Sometimes this can take a second. All right, so we got all these islands on top of each other now. Sometimes you just want a quick way. You just got a mess. You just want a quick way to arrange them out, or kind of like this, you got them laid out and you're kind of just waiting to be puzzled. We can start out by selecting them, and then with our layout, you can actually get these to stack for you. See how it kind of packed it or puzzled for you, not stacked. See how it's puzzled for us? It's laid out as little space is used as possible. But we're running into a problem. We don't have much UV border padding. So if we hold down Shift and select Layout, we can open up the menu, the layout options in here. For the most part, default settings will not take care of our shell padding for us. I want to go in and see where it says packing resolution. Let's change that to 2048. Let's change our shell padding to 10. And let's see how that works now. Perfect. Now we get some breathing room between our islands. And for the most part, that's a pretty good quick UV layout. You can get away with some automatic layouts like this, but I don't know if you remember how it used to look. There wasn't big gaps of space up here in the corners like that. So, yeah, make sure you don't rely too much on automation. I never try to teach workflows that rely totally on automation, kind of like this. Like I said, maybe it's just a good starting point or get an idea. There's some good ideas going on here, and then maybe you can just pack it a little bit better.